Well, we have had one season of Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast, and I have talked about 18 separate versions of the tale. I'm going to do some season one wrap up in today's episode and then talk about where this podcast is headed in the future. It's one of the most influential books ever written. Even if you've never read Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, you are familiar with it. My name is Collin and I've loved this story for as long as I can remember. I'm going to be taking a look at all of the movie and TV adaptations of A Christmas Carol that I can because I love the story that much. This is Scrooge, a Christmas Carol podcast. Let me start by just thanking everyone who has listened, shared, left comments, left replies on videos, left replies on app, rated this, left reviews, anything you've done to further this podcast anywhere. I am really grateful. People have reached out with very nice comments on social media and just as friends. A lot of nice things that people have said about this, and I'm glad because I'm really excited to be doing this. I've had a lot of fun doing this so far, and I'm glad that it's so enjoyable for everyone else as well, because this is something I really love to talk about. I don't get tired of it. When I got through the end of this season, I was already excited about the next versions I'll be talking about in the future. So, yeah, I'm really glad that everyone has been wanting this because I've gotten very, very nice feedback. So I'm excited to continue this podcast. So thank you, first and foremost, if you're listening now, and thank you that you'll be listening in the future. I really do appreciate it. I have two very minor corrections to issue based on things I said on certain episodes that weren't exactly right. On the 1977 BBC Christmas Carol with Michael Hordon, I said that Bernard Lee was best known for playing Q in the James Bond films. He was best known for playing M. One of those letters, I said the wrong one. I knew which it was when I read it, and then I said the wrong letter. He played M, who was James Bond's boss, not Q. And then in the 1938 Christmas Carol, the very first episode, I was kind of just casually mentioning some things I had read about it. And I said that I thought Anne Rutherford had said it was a B movie. It was actually June Lockhart. She played one of the young Cratchit children, and her parents played Bob Cratchit and his wife in that movie. She was pretty young in that movie. I think she played Belinda, and she said later on that it was a B movie. June Lockhart, still with us as of this recording. Very interesting person. In the 70s, she was apparently a big David Bowie fan despite being born in the 20s. So, very interesting person. And Terry Kilburn, who played Tiny Tim in 1938, A Christmas Carol, also, as of this recording, still with us. So, long life for some of those people in that movie. Okay, so we have talked about, as I mentioned, 18 versions of this story so far. And we'll just go over them briefly here, talk about some common things we've found between them. Of these 18, I would say three of them are great. These are thoroughly entertaining and gripping. They understand the themes of the story and no major flaws, although each of these versions, I would say, does have some small flaws. These would be Scrooge 1951, A Christmas Carol 1971, the Richard Williams short, and An American Christmas Carol that we talked about most recently. All three of these understand the book. They get the themes of poverty. They get why scenes are in the book. And if they cut scenes or change scenes, for the most part, they're doing it with good cause and for good reason. Scrooge 1951, the biggest flaws for me are the portrayal of Fred, which is pretty bland and kind of mean, and Christmas Yet to Come being all out of order. That one's actually bigger. The Richard Williams one, there are barely minor flaws. The only real flaw is don't make it your first version because for what it's doing in 25 minutes, it's as good as it can be. I can't imagine a 25-minute version being better. And there is a 25-minute version coming up that is famous that I love a lot that I don't think is quite as good. I think the Richard Williams one really, really is great for what it is and just as an adaptation in general, it's wonderful. And then An American Christmas Carol, I genuinely think is great. Yeah, Mr. T, silly naming. Beyond that, it's great. Really not much I can say against that. It's if you know what you're getting going in for, it's a really, really entertaining, well-made film. Then we have two versions I would say are very good. These are ones that understand the themes well, still very entertaining and well made, but the flaws are a little bit bigger, and they're just not quite as great as those top three. These are just two. These are Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol and Carol for Another Christmas, both from the 1960s. Mr. Magoo swaps the past and the present, which is very odd and takes away from the storytelling a bit. And speaking of storytelling, Carol for Another Christmas just needs more. But these are both very good Christmas carols, and I highly recommend both of them. They really understand the book, and they do a good job of adapting it, whether it's through the Magoo character or through Rod Serling's unique lens. I think both understand the story quite well. And this might seem strange based on how much I love the story, but I think these five are the only good adaptations so far. Not saying the only entertaining version so far, but of the 18 versions I've watched, these are the only five that actually adapt the work well consistently. And they do it very well. Unsurprisingly, the five versions at the top here are the only versions with great Scrooges so far. It takes a lot to really be in that top tier, but these five, yeah, all five of them have great Scrooges. In my opinion, it's hard to have a great adaptation without a great Scrooge, and vice versa. Although there might be versions in the future where both are the case. I can definitely think of one, if memory serves, where there's a great Scrooge and not a great adaptation. And yeah, there's probably another one I can think of that is a great adaptation, but not a great Scrooge. For the most part, though, you really have those hand in hand. So after those, we have versions that I would say are entertaining, but they aren't good adaptations. Here we have Scrooge 1935 with Seymour Hicks, Scrooge 1970 with Albert Finney, and I'll even throw in the Frederick March version here from 1954. All three of these have scenes that are brilliant. The 1935 one has that scene at the Lord Mayor's banquet Christmas Eve. Wonderful stuff. The 1971 has Thank You Very Much and some great past scenes. The Frederick March one has still my favorite take on the Marley scene. So, all three great scenes as an adaptation, they just don't work. Scrooge 1935 does not go into Scrooge's past well at all. It just starts with him as a miser. A lot else about it works. Scrooge 1970, it boils the message just down to you should be nicer to people and enjoy your life. Way too simple. And the 1954 version kind of falls apart by the end. I don't think it works in present and yet to come, but it starts off really strong. So that's three versions that I would say are entertaining, fun to watch, really great scenes, not good adaptations. After that, there are five versions that I would just say are fine. They know the plot beats they're adapting, but they don't understand the message, and there aren't really any brilliant moments. These would be A Christmas Carol 1938 with Reginald Owen, Hales of Dickens, A Christmas Carol, and The Stingiest Man in Town. Those are the two Basil Rathbone ones. The BBC 1977 one with Michael Hordern, and Bugs Bunny's Christmas Carol, which, again, it's a 7-minute cartoon. It's fine. Finally, there are versions which are, put simply, just bad. They're bad adaptations and they're bad productions. These are The Christmas Carol 1949, The Stingiest Man in Town remake from Rankin Bass, A Special Sesame Street Christmas, The Australian Christmas Carol from 1969, and Rich Little's Christmas Carol. Yeah, just none of these really are adapting to work in any way that would suggest they understand it. Some of them are fun in a bad way, others are just unpleasant to watch. So, yeah, as you can tell, I'm a little particular about what really makes a great adaptation. I know there are a lot of famous versions coming up in the near future, though, because we'll be talking next Christmas about the 80s and 90s versions, at least up to a certain point in the 90s. I haven't scheduled it all out yet, but I know we'll be touching on like Mickey's Christmas Carol and Scrooged and the George C. Scott A Christmas Carol and Muppet Christmas Carol. These are all famous and beloved versions, and they offer a lot. So we've still got a lot of famous versions to come, and I'm going to have a lot to say about those. All those I just mentioned, I imagine, will be their own episode. I'm assuming Mickey's Christmas Carol will be. Maybe I'll lump it together with something else, but all those others will definitely be their own episodes. Talk a little bit more about the 45 years worth of adaptations we've covered so far, because while there are wildly different versions, there are some interesting themes that pop up. After this, we'll cover some questions, comments from social media. So, some themes I've noticed in these early versions. One very, very positive thing I've noticed from two different versions is versions that update the story for a different time really understand the message. So that would be Carol for Another Christmas and An American Christmas Carol. Those feel more in the spirit of Charles Dickens than so many of the direct adaptations I've covered. Carol for Another Christmas really nails what a Scrooge figure would look like in the 1964 political setting, where he's an isolationist, but also, he wants to build defense, and he's cold and he cuts people off and doesn't think everyone deserves to have a good life. Are there no prisons, are there no workhouses extends to like prisoner of war camps around the world and children suffering all over the world. So it's really a great Scrooge in a modern setting. And Sterling Hayden is phenomenal in that. And An American Christmas Carol, which is not set in the modern day of the film, it's set in 1933, but it still has themes that are universal then and now about poverty and how the rich get richer and don't help those around them. It really nails the community aspect of A Christmas Carol of you need to be helping those around you. You have the means. You can do it. And by the end, Benedict Slade, Henry Winkler's character, does it in many ways. He gives back what he took. He opens up a quarry for more jobs to become available. He adopts a boy or fosters a boy. So he does a lot of good deeds by the end that are going to really help his whole community get back on track. Yeah, that version understands the message so well, and I really appreciate it for that. It really is trying to be a Christmas Carol in that setting, but it develops it in a very American way. The 1951 version, of course, very, very well understands it as well. And to be fair, my issues with the 1935 Seymour Hicks version aside, it absolutely gets the class divide. So I love it for that. Another common feature of many of these Christmas carols, which I've talked about at length, so I'll keep it short here, is the weird hell stuff. These 70s versions, I'll tell you, they really love including the devil in some form. But I talked about this a lot between Scrooge 1970 and the animated adaptations in the episode after that. So I'm not going to talk too much more about the hell stuff here. But yeah, those 70s versions sure love to include scenes of hell or of threatening people with hell. And that doesn't stop there. The most overt ones come in the 70s, but into the 80s and 90s and even 2000s, there's little hints here and there that we really don't need. Again, if Scrooge doesn't think dying alone with no one to care for him and people being happy that he's gone is enough to make a change, I don't think the fires of hell are going to do it. But, you know, it's what it is. They exist. It's kind of funny that so many versions suddenly started throwing that into their adaptations. Another thing that I noticed with the early adaptations is Bob Cratchit is often very underwhelming. This is specifically the 30s through the 50s, not including the Alistair Sim one where Mervyn Johns is a fantastic Bob Cratchit. But yeah, those early ones, Bob Cratchit is really not that interesting. In the 40s and 50s ones, the TV versions, they're often cut for time. Some of them are 25 minutes, some are about an hour-ish. And Stingiest Man in Town's a little longer, but there's more songs. So Bob Cratchit really does not get a lot of focus in those. We see the Cratchit family, and their scenes mainly exist to show a family celebrating Christmas. Bob Cratchit is not well developed in those, and the actors don't really do that much to make him memorable. And the 1930s Bob Cratchit's the 2-1 film. They do get moments. I think Donald Calthrop in the 1935 film has a really great moment in Christmas Yet to Come. But when he's trying to be goofy, it's really goofy. And Gene Lockhart in the 1938 one, he's fine. He's just not doing anything interesting with the character. I don't think he really inhabits the character of Bob Cratchit. I think he's just kind of there. And they make him do stupid stuff in that, like get fired. So, yeah. Another thing, unfortunately for a lot of these, is forgettable songs. There are some great songs in these versions. I love most of the songs in the Magoo special. I love a few of the songs in Scrooge 1970, but oh man, there are some forgettable songs on these. Every single song from The Stingiest Man in Town, outside of the Sing a Christmas Carol kind of through line song, it's just forgettable. And then The Stingiest Man in Town by Rankin Bass, they just bring them all back. Every song from that original special, again in the Rankin Bass special. Now, I do like Birthday Party of the King a little better in the Rankin Bass one because it really tries to play it sincerely, and Tom Bosley does a really nice performance of it, but it's not a needed song. I mean, it's just it's just a religious Christmas song thrown in the middle there. Doesn't really add anything to the story. Most of the songs in Stingiest Man in Town are not good. So maybe they would play better on stage, but it started as a TV musical, so I can't say. There are, of course, a few very bad songs. I have a running tally of every song in any version, and when we get to the very end of this whole project, I will absolutely share my top songs, my bottom songs. Not gonna do that right now, but I have running lists of the best and worst of everything, so much to talk about at the end of all of this when we get through every version I can. But for now, I'm just holding on to those lists of best and worst of various things, including every adaptation, every Scrooge, every Bob Cratchit, etc. Another thing that I have found in some of these specials is there's a predominant focus on Belle. So in the book, we get the impression that all of these various things led to Scrooge being who he is today. And I always look at it as each version can choose their own focus specifically as to whether it was the breakup with Belle that perhaps was the final step in the process, or perhaps his father's bad relationship with him made him who he was, or perhaps the death of Fan. And I've seen a lot of these versions from the 50s on, especially, will put a big focus on Belle and that relationship ending being really hard time for Scrooge. The 1935 one is the first to have that seem to be the primary focus because we see Scrooge and Belle breaking up, and then we see what could have been with Belle and her family. The two musical versions from the 1950s have big focus on Belle. The 1970 musical, again, big focus on Belle. That's kind of the whole driving force of those past scenes in the Albert Finney film. So a lot of those versions that focus on Belle don't talk as much about Scrooge's business life. That's left more in the background. And obviously part of his changing views towards the world are what led to his breakup. So it's not that it's not happening, but they suggest that his relationship gone wrong had a big effect on him. While the 1951 film does have Belle, we see scenes of Belle, engagement, breakup, etc. But the 1951 film mostly focuses on his rising business, which is a really interesting way to look at it because the predominant force in his life there was Mr. Jorkin, the corrupt person who buys him out from Fezziwig. So that one has less focus on the relationship comparatively, while a lot of musical versions will focus on his love life, which makes sense. That's nice and romantic. You can write songs about it. But that seems to be the main focus in these adaptations is that his love life steered him a certain way. There's another version, at least one that I can think of, where they actually choose to focus on his relationship with Fan, his sister, as being a big driving force in his life. And when he lost her, that's the darkest point in his life. Not a lot of versions do that. A lot of versions kind of put Fan aside. She might get her one scene. And even in the version I'm thinking of, she only really has one scene, but she's brought up so often that it implies that that was really the best thing in his life was his relationship with his sister, while so many versions here point to it being his relationship with Belle. So I think it's really interesting which version focuses on what. 1970 version with Albert Finney tries to combine the two into a weird kind of like they were both good for him, which they were, but don't combine sister and lover. That's weird. So there have been some comments and questions that people have left, and I'm gonna read through some of these that people have left on YouTube, Blue Sky, etc. First up, this is a very nice comment. Someone left a reply on my Mr. Magoo video that they've loved the special all their life. The score is exquisite, which absolutely I love it. They said they're partial because their aunt, Marie Matthews, played young Scrooge in this and sang All Alone in the World. So that's really cool. Thank you for leaving that. It's always nice to hear family of people who are actually in these specials reach out. The Mr. Magoo Christmas Carol, it was the first animated Christmas special for television. And even though it doesn't have the lasting appeal of like The Grinch or Charlie Brown Christmas or Rudolph or the other Rankin Bass ones from those times, it's still a cult classic and rightfully so. A lot of people still watch it every year. So yeah, thank you for reaching out with that comment. That's really cool. Another person said about the 1970 musical with Albert Finney. I first saw this version in 1981. I was in middle school and homesick right before Christmas. Not keen on musicals, but I enjoy it, although it's certainly uneven. The Scrooge in Hell segment was missing in every TV broadcast I watched. When I got the film on VHS, it surprised me to finally see it. So that's really interesting. I had heard there were versions that cut it out. I didn't realize it was every TV airing for a certain time, which is fine because it adds absolutely nothing to the story. So that would be surreal if you think you know a movie and then you buy it on home media and suddenly there's a whole scene in hell, especially if you're a child. That'd be horrifying. So that's really interesting that so many cuts of that didn't have the hell scene. I know a lot of versions didn't have the overture either, which is less dramatic when you notice that in there. Got another one here about Scrooge 1970 from Malden3659. The I Hate People song is weird. Since Scrooge doesn't really hate people, I'd say he's more indifferent and apathetic towards people. That's what most of the best Christmas Carol adaptations get, at least. Thank you for the comment. Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think hate is a word that is in Scrooge's mind. He may not like being around people, but I would agree that apathy is a much better word. It's a very overly simplified motivation for Scrooge to just say he hates people. So I would absolutely agree that indifference and apathy are much more accurate terms for Scrooge. Although I'm assuming a song called I'm Indifferent Towards Most People wouldn't be as catchy. Vanity Wild says, I always gauge my favorite versions by the Marley scene, the least annoying Cratchit children, and Scrooge's repentance not being over the top, silly, and joyful. I think that's a very interesting way to do it. I would agree with a lot of that because those are the three scenes that do tend to be overdone. I think probably more than anything. A lot of Marley scenes are over the top scary. There is scariness to be had there. I don't deny that the scenes should be eerie, have great build up, but some overdo it to the point of it being comical. Yeah, I agree that the Marley scene is a good way to judge an adaptation because if it has the heart, if Marley is sad, you know you're on the right track. If Marley's just trying to scare Scrooge, yeah, you're probably not watching the best adaptation. The Cratchit scene, you have to get a lot out in that scene, right? You have to, even if you don't have like Martha coming home from her apprenticeship, or even Bob and Tim at church talking about church, you have to establish that, yeah, Tiny Tim's not well. This family looks out for him. They love Christmas despite what they have. And Bob and his wife have a really good marriage. You have to establish all of that. So it could come off a little bit saccharine if not done right. And I think the best versions will cut it with Scrooge having realizations. Because if he's not, if you're just playing the scene straight, it's going to be a little bit overly sweet, maybe even syrupy. And there are versions where it really feels syrupy. The 1938 one kind of has that, but it's even sadder though because Bob's been fired. So the 1971 goes over the top with how Bob raises a toast to Scrooge. He defends his boss way more than anyone ever should. Yeah, the 1951 I think does it really well. They're a really nice family, and you get the impression they care about each other, but also they're aware of their situation. So, and I think the Magoo one does that well. Even though that's all we get in that version of Christmas Present, we do get a really good Cratchit scene in the Mr. Magoo version as well. And number three, I think I agree with even more than the other two of Scrooge's repentance being realistic and not too over the top, because there are some where he just goes full ham and it's too much. The 1935 one, despite my other issues with Scrooge in that one, I think he has a good redemption in that. Seymour Hicks does well with that part. Alistair Sim is very over the top. I like it for the most part. but it's one of those things that I could nitpick with that if I really wanted to, because he's, like, standing on his head and dancing around in circles, and it's funny, and I still love Alistair Sim in that, but I like his subtler moments better. So, if he wasn't doing those silly things, it wouldn't change the movie that much for me. I like how happy we know he is deep down. It doesn't matter if he's dancing around or not, but he went all out for it, and it's fine. It's very funny. Reginald Owen, though, yeah, no, too over the top goofy, but that whole performance just isn't great, so, yeah, I agree, Scrooge can go really over the top in the Christmas morning scenes like Albert Finney does as well, and, yeah, it really brings down those scenes. Sometimes they go far too short because the movie has to wrap up. The Albert Finney one actually goes way too long, so you gotta pace them well, and a lot of versions don't pace Christmas morning well. The Michael Horden one really rushes it. There's a fine line there, and I'm not sure if we've had a version yet that's a direct adaptation that actually paces Christmas morning well, like, really exquisitely well. American Christmas Carol does, but that's not a direct adaptation. Obviously, everything in the Richard Williams one, as much as I love it, is a little too fast. Alistair Sim one, again, it's good, but it could be longer. I wish he had making up with the charity workers scene. I wish he had even more time at Fred's, because I love when Scrooge gets to spend time with Fred. So, that's actually only briefly mentioned in the book that Scrooge goes to Fred's, and versions expand on it, of course, but it is in the book. It's just very briefly mentioned in passing, and then this and the George C. Scott version in particular give us a scene at Fred's. The George C. Scott one goes longer than this one. I think the Jim Carrey one does too. It has a pretty lengthy scene at Fred's. Yeah, thank you for that comment, and I agree on all three. It's a good way to gauge the strength of a version because those three scenes can often be overdone. Okay. Freedom Fighter 64 on Blue Sky asks, in A Christmas Carol, we learn that Scrooge's mother died giving birth to him, and his father so resented Scrooge for this that he sends him away to school. Scrooge has a younger sister, however. Did Scrooge's father remarry? Thank you for the question. So this is one that actually does not come from the book, despite it being kind of the version of the story that's accepted in pop culture. And I think this is because Scrooge 1951 does it. So in the book, we learn only one thing about Scrooge's father. Well, I mean, it's one thing, but it kind of speaks to two things. He used to not be very nice, but he's kinder than he used to be. That's all we see. That's one line from Fan. Father is far kinder than he used to be. That's all we know about him. A lot of versions will expand on this. Scrooge 1951 does expand on this by saying that Scrooge's mother died in childbirth and then Fan died in childbirth. So that's why Scrooge's father resented him, and that's why Scrooge resents Fred. Now, in the book, it's very clear they say outright Fan is the younger sister. So that wouldn't make sense if they're full siblings because they have the same mother. But in Scrooge 1951 and Christmas Carol in 1984 with George C. Scott, they make Fan the older sister. So Scrooge is now younger and the mother died in birth. Now, in the George C. Scott one, they don't say that that also happened to Fan. And it's actually implied that's not what happened because the way Fred talks about her in that version, and I'll get to more about this when we get to this adaptation, but he definitely knew his mother in adulthood, or at least in, childhood, teenage years, because he talks about her a certain way that suggests he's spoken to her. And if she died in childbirth, obviously, he would not have. So the 1951 version, 1984 version, both have it that Scrooge's mother died in childbirth, and I think that's why that has become the common interpretation of Scrooge's relationship with his father, but that's actually not from the book. And one more question here. Andre K33 on YouTube asks, if you could add an original scene to any of the ghosts, which would it be and what would the scene be about? So I've been thinking about this a lot because a lot of versions do variations on scenes from the book, but they're not really new scenes. They're a spin on something that's briefly touched on in the book. This isn't from a ghost scene, but Scrooge 1935 has that lengthy portion at the Lord Mayor's feast. And that is actually very, very briefly mentioned in the book. They mention that the Lord Mayor is preparing for his feast, or they're preparing the tables for the feast. It's brief, but it is there. So that is actually a scene from the book, although we see it actually in action. The 1951 film, of course, adds a whole bunch to Scrooge's past, stuff that's not from the book with Mr. Jorkin. I like a lot of that. The 1984 film also has a scene in Christmas Present where we see a very poor family struggling to make it on Christmas night. It's dark and bleak, and they talk about going to the poorhouse the next day. That's also not from the book. It's very much in the spirit of the book, and I like that scene a lot as well. But that's not actually answering the question, I realize. Also, the thank you very much scene from Scrooge 1970 is a version of a scene from the book. It's a very different spin on it, but it is absolutely a spin on a scene from the book. So if I had to add something to what's already in the book, I'll do one for past and one for present because I can think of one for both I'd like to do. I think Yet to Come is very good as it is. So for past, I think a scene of Jacob Marley in the past would be helpful. Not a dying Jacob Marley, even though we get that in at least one version. I want to see Scrooge and Marley as young men starting their business. Maybe you could tie this into the Belle scene somehow, right? Like she sees them together working and it kind of makes her despair. Maybe Marley's a little bit worse. He's a bad influence on Scrooge. I would like to see them starting their business somehow. Maybe they both start out idealistic, Many variations you could do on this. They'd all be in line with the book because we get nothing about who Marley was except that he was like Scrooge. So I think there's a lot of potential. Just a scene of Jacob Marley in the past could add a lot to the tragedy of the Jacob Marley scene that we get when he's a ghost. Also, maybe it'd be nice to see more of Fan, but if I have to pick one, it'd be something with Jacob Marley. Christmas Present, I mentioned that scene in the 1984 film because it would be something like that. I think there should be something with someone even poorer than the Cratchits. I mean, this is implied in the book, right? They go to basically every Christmas. I'd like to see an actual scene play out with someone who's poorer. I think that would be more on the nose of what Dickens is getting at and could fit the story very well. Doesn't need to be a character Scrooge has met yet. Could just be someone who's trying to make it on Christmas Day. You could even take that scene from the book where Scrooge and the Spirit talk about bakeries shutting their doors, somehow turn that scene into storytelling instead of preaching. I like what Dickens is getting at with that scene, but I think if you make it into storytelling, it would be more compelling. Christmas Yet to Come, love it how it is. Wouldn't change anything. I've always wondered, could they incorporate Fred more into Christmas Yet to Come? But I've always thought that was a deliberate move on the ghost's part, not to show Fred, because Fred absolutely would be sad that his uncle is dead. No matter what's happened between them, Fred would be sad his uncle died. And you can't show Scrooge that, because you can't actually show him tenderness connected to his death. They instead talk about Fred helping the Cratchits out, which is a real middle finger to Scrooge, because he could have been helping them out that whole time. No, I wouldn't add anything to Christmas Yet to Come. But thank you for that question, because I've been thinking about that a lot, of what scenes I would add if I could. Not saying it needs anything, but if I was doing an adaptation, yeah, I'd maybe want to include a little bit about Marley. At least one person has asked if I would show the scoreboard that I used to rate each adaptation, and absolutely, I can post that on social media. I'm planning at the end of this all to do a big episode YouTube video, probably, where I count up the scores for the most faithful adaptations, or perhaps just the most famous ones, but where we can compare and contrast which ones get things right. If you've seen the YouTuber Cinemassacre, he has great horror videos. He did one like that with Dracula, where he compared the 12 most famous adaptations of Dracula and gave points for each plot point, character, description, things like that. I thought that was a really fun video, so I might do something like that once we get to the end with like the 10 or 12 most famous adaptations, just so you can see how they scored, because it's really interesting to compare. And again, the version with the most points is by no means the best adaptation, or even, in my opinion, the most faithful adaptation, even though they might have the most points. Right now, the leader on that board is the Michael Horden one, which I do not think is by any means the most faithful adaptation. It just includes a lot of things. I'll go ahead and go over how they've all scored so far. If you're curious at the moment, though, the current leader is the Michael Horden one, as I mentioned, the BBC one from 1977. That has a 69.5. In second place is the Richard Williams one, the 25-minute short from 1971, which is right behind at a 67.5. And then just 3 points behind that, we have the Alistair Sim one at 64.5. So three very, very close point-wise adaptations. And then fairly close behind that, missed a lot of the past things, is the Seymour Hicks one with 60.5. Again, if the Seymour Hicks one had the past scenes from the book and kept everything else, it would be a remarkably faithful adaptation. But as it is, it's not too bad. After that, they do drop off a bit. You've got the 1938 one with Reginald Owen at 50 and a half. And you have 46 points for Mr. Magoo, who's next after that. And you've got 44.5 points for Scrooge with Albert Finney. So those are the highest scorers so far. A lot of ones drop off after that. The low scorer, not counting the loose adaptations like Bugs Bunny or An American Christmas Carol or anything like that. The low scorer would be Rich Little's Christmas Carol with 21.5. So some big swings all over the board here. Again, that's a parody version of the story, but it still follows the beats of the book, so it's a direct adaptation. The Shower of Stars one with Frederick March, only a little bit higher than that at 23. So some very, very unfaithful adaptations of the story based on that scoreboard. So like I said, many all over the place. I have not run other versions through yet, but just knowing how the scoreboard works, I think there will be a couple versions that surpass the ones on here. I can think of a few that are remarkably faithful. But for now, yes, the 1977 BBC one is the leader for adaptation points. Another thing that I don't think anyone has asked directly, but I'm sure people wonder about is if I will tackle movies that are inspired by A Christmas Carol. Now, I'm not talking like An American Christmas Carol, A Carol for Another Christmas, which are, despite not being direct adaptations, still absolutely drawing intentionally from Dickens. I'm talking more something like It's a Wonderful Life, which takes something from the story and makes it its own, or even like something How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which absolutely has a Scrooge type figure at the center, or even The Last Temptation of Christ, which kind of borrows a bit in the ending from both A Christmas Carol and It's a Wonderful Life, or even The Green Knight from a few years ago, which does the same. You could go pretty far with this because there's a lot of things people take from these. And I think what I might do with that, I'm still considering this, but I probably will do a whole episode on movies that take something from A Christmas Carol, right? Like the ones I just mentioned, that take a little bit from it, but they don't really warrant a whole episode because it wouldn't be talking about Christmas Carol adaptations to talk about the rest of those movies. So I might do an episode on those in one of these upcoming months, and that's what I'm going to be talking about here shortly, is what I'm going to be doing throughout the rest of the year before we get to November again. Now, there is one movie that I'm gonna have to rewatch because I think it will warrant its own episode, even though it's not a direct adaptation, and that's the 1997 movie The Game, starring Michael Douglas and directed by David Fincher. I saw this years ago when I was in college, and I remember thinking then, and I remember thinking since, and reading some other people who said the same, that it is pretty much an adaptation of A Christmas Carol, even if it's not listed as such. It's about a rich man who goes through a dreamlike sequence to reconsider his life. It's not holiday based. It's not about Christmas, but it still feels like a Christmas Carol adaptation, so I'm gonna revisit that one at some point, and that may warrant its own episode. If it doesn't, it'll just be on that episode with stories inspired by A Christmas Carol, which I think there's an episode to be had there at least because so many stories take from A Christmas Carol. So this is mostly a seasonal podcast. The main episodes of this show will be coming in November and December of each year. Uh, Not that I wouldn't want to do something like that year round, but that's when people want to talk about adaptations of A Christmas Carol. Obviously, you watch them in December, November for the most part, and I think that's when it'll be best to release them. But I'm going to continue on dropping one episode a month throughout the year, and I have some interesting things to cover. So, most importantly, what I'll be doing for each month is doing a page by page analysis of the book. I had originally said I wasn't going to read through the whole book on the podcast, and actually, I'm not. It will be an audiobook from LibriVox. They're a wonderful service. They do free public domain audiobooks. You're welcome to use them in any context. They have that on their website. They are welcome to use. If the book is in the public domain, they can release an audiobook of it, and the audiobook is in the public domain. Wonderful stuff. They have great narrators. Highly recommend listening to LibriVox. And I'll be using the version that I like to listen to, that I've listened to for many a year, of A Christmas Carol, and I'll be playing a bit and then talking a bit about things like cultural context or cultural references. There are references to mythology and the Bible and things like that that often get left out in adaptations. And there are also, of course, some scenes that get left out in adaptations. And I kind of want to talk about just everything in the book. I think it's a story that warrants basically a word by word analysis. I think everything in it is interesting. And there's a lot that I think, again, people who've watched a lot of adaptations may not know from the book, and it may help you appreciate adaptations even more. I know listening to it and reading it, I've appreciated adaptations even more and seeing what they keep in that I didn't even realize was inspired by the book. As I was mentioning in the part where I talked about scenes I would add, I think you might catch some things from your favorite adaptations that are actually taken right from the book. So, yeah, I want to talk about the book in detail. I'm not sure how many episodes that's gonna take. I'm guessing it'll be about 2 per section of the book. The book sections are called staves, and there's 5 staves. Marley's Ghost, 1 for each of the spirits after that, and then the final one on Christmas morning. So I'm guessing each of the first 4 staves will take 2 episodes. I'm guessing completely. It could take more, maybe it won't take that much. But just based on how long the reading is and how much analysis I think I'll have, I'm guessing about 2 episodes per stave, and the last one will probably just be 1 episode because that's a fairly short ending to it all. So, once a month, I will be dropping new episodes. This one is dropping on January 1st, New Year's Day. So, in February, you can listen out for my first episode of that. I may also, depending on my schedule, drop bonus episodes if there's a non-Christmas adaptation I want to cover. There are a few adaptations that actually don't have anything to do with Christmas, so might drop those throughout the year. But yeah, I'm going to keep the main bulk of Christmas Carol adaptations within November and December because that's really when people go back and watch them and talk about them and they're kind of in the zeitgeist. So I think that's still best, and I have so many big ones that are coming up in the next year's worth of episodes because I know I'm going into the 80s and 90s, and that's where a whole lot of nostalgic ones are coming. So looking forward to that, but I'm really looking forward to breaking down the book as a whole, and I think it'll be very informative if you've read the book or if you haven't read the book. There's really a lot to get out of it. So I hope you will listen to that. And I want to thank everyone for listening so far because this has been great. All your comments have been wonderful. I really appreciate everyone who has listened, reached out, left comments, reviewed, everything else, followed me on social media. It's really been great. I hope this continues to grow as a podcast because I've had a lot of fun doing it so far, and I know I will continue to. Glad to hear that people have enjoyed listening to it. So, yeah, be on the lookout for that. Most likely, I'll be trying to drop episodes on the first Wednesday of the month, but that could change. But for now, that's what we'll go with. First Wednesday of the month, once a month episodes, till we get back to November again and we go back to weekly. Thank you for listening to Scrooge, a Christmas Carol podcast. Scrooge, a Christmas Carol podcast is written, hosted, and edited by Collin Murr. Theme music is Christmas Day by TRG Banks, and TRG Banks Snowfall is also used for interstitial music. Leaving a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing on YouTube will be a big help to me. I'll be back next month with another episode of Scrooge, a Christmas Carol podcast. Until then, make sure to live in the past, the present, and the future, and ensure that the spirits of all three strive within you.